Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. Really glad to have you all here. This video is going to be my midway through October reading check-in and a slight here are some new books that have come into my life a little bit. Overall, this has not been the greatest time I have had reading. I have had a DNF, a book that I hate read until the end, a book that I thought was going to be amazing that was just okay, and then thankfully I did have two pretty good reads kind of recently towards the end of my mid-month period. So let's start with the DNF, and then we're going to move from the books I liked the least to the books I liked the most, and top it all off with some new books that have come into my life. So the DNF was one of the books on my spooky season TBR, and that was Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. This is a folk horror novel that was written in the 1970s that takes place in a small New England town. There's a lot of agricultural horror and just small town insularity that is supposed to have us be scared. And the premise of this was much more interesting than the actual execution. The big part of the reason why I DNF'd this was that there was so much of nothing happening in what is supposed to be a pretty plot-driven novel. And I also found a lot of the things that the author used, the devices the author used to try and create suspense, to be completely ineffective because they were so outlandish that I couldn't believe them enough to then buy into their reality. Chief among them being that the main character's child has psychosomatic asthma, which is not a thing. Asthma can be exacerbated by stress, but basically whenever there was a lull in the action and the author needed to insert more drama, the child would have a near-death experience or an actual death and then come back to life experience because of her psychosomatic asthma. And I was just I cannot take this seriously. I wasn't enjoying it, and again, this is not the kind of book where I felt it was going to be worth it to continue to stick with it until the end, so I DNF'd this about halfway through. Sorry, but not really. The book that I liked the least, and honestly, this is saying a lot because this is actually coming for Catabasis as my least favorite book that I have read all year, was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. I read this for my genre book club, which has not met yet, but I absolutely hated this book. Again, it was a book where the premise seemed cool. It was supposed to be a haunted house type horror story that takes place in a knockoff IKEA. It started out kind of being a little campy and Scooby-Doo-like and having some commentary on the hell that is working retail. And while the prose wasn't anything terribly exciting, I was okay, I can get involved with enjoying this concept here. And then it takes a very sudden turn to what I think is supposed to be hard R horror, but to me it was just written in such a silly way that was so disjointed from the tone of the original and from the way that the characters behaved that, again, I couldn't take the scary stuff seriously. It was just kind of gross and boring. It was not frightening to me, which is a shame because it is supposed to be a horror story. But it also completely lets a lot of the social commentary fall by the wayside, and the characters, which do appear kind of more one-dimensional or stock characters early on in the novel. I would have hoped that by challenging them with the scary stuff that they have to deal with in this haunted store, would have given them the opportunity to grow and develop as characters a little bit. And unfortunately, that just didn't happen. So I basically was kind of enjoying the first third of this book, and then I hate read the final 2/3 of the book. I know that's kind of an unpopular opinion and that a lot of readers really like this author, but this book, I just couldn't. I could not with this book. It was not the book for me. And it wasn't particularly well written enough for me to say, yeah, it just wasn't to my taste, but I respect it. So there we go. Woof. Okay, and then I have my final book from the first spooky season TBR that I posted, which was Grievers. This is a novella by Adrienne Marie Brown. It's part of AK Press's Black Dawn series, which is kind of a speculative series run by a very anarchist forward political press. And this is a story that is about a pandemic that takes place in Detroit. We are following the character of Dune, who is a Black queer woman, and her mother becomes the patient zero of this pandemic, where it appears that people basically become frozen in the middle of their everyday lives and their everyday activities due to grief. It winds up being a disease or a condition that affects only the Black people in the city, but of course there's ripple effects throughout the full society, both within the medical establishment, the racial hierarchy of who gets access to resources and who gets to leave the city to maybe follow a path to greater safety versus who is left behind or needs to stay. It also engages a lot with the lineages of the main character's activism, because she comes from a family that is very into activism and community organizing and very involved in that. And this is kind of also a book about her taking up the mantle of the elders in her family as they have begun to pass away, either from this grief epidemic or from something else. So I thought this book, again, it was fine. It was good. There was definitely a decent amount of just beautiful prose that I enjoyed, sentences that I underlined or starred there. I think just overall, this is much more of a novella that is about the idea of grief as an epidemic, of sadness as an illness that can have real impacts on our lives. But beyond that, there wasn't as much to it. And I think that was because this is just a novella, so there's less time to develop the character and the plot. But still, it was good. I would recommend it if you are interested in the concept. And I believe the author has written, I think this is a trilogy. I may be wrong about that, but I know that she's written other stories that are set in the world where the grief pandemic is happening. It is very sad. It is very heavy of a book. So keep that in mind. This is not your sort of fun, campy horror story. This is very real and very raw. All right, and then we will wrap this up with the book that I actually just finished today and I really enjoyed, and that is Hemlock and Silver, which is the new release by T. Kingfisher. I have mentioned this before, but just in case you're new to my channel, this is the first year that I started reading T. Kingfisher, and I have become obsessed with her work. I really enjoy it. And this was no exception. Again, love the acid green on these pages. I said this before, but it reminds me of the Green Apple Jolly Rancher, and it's just very pleasing to look at. So this is a sort of dark fantasy, almost like a fairy tale story, where we are following a healer named Anya who has absolutely terrible bedside manner, but an unabashed and persistent curiosity in discovering different things about poisons, how they affect the human body, and how to remedy them. And she is called to investigate this mysterious poisoning of the king's daughter, Snow, who has been taken ill in a mysterious way since her mother and sister died very tragically and very violently. And the king enlists Anya's help to try and figure out what's wrong, because Anya is the person that doesn't give up when the going gets tough. So I really liked that we had another protagonist similar to a lot of the fantasy books I've enjoyed this year, where we have an older female protagonist. She's 35, which is older than I think a lot of female protagonists in fantasy books these days. She has a very just direct and forthright personality. She's an unapologetically fat character, and she kind of just doesn't take guff from anybody. So I really liked that about her. I also loved how this really blended the fantasy and the horror elements. That was very much to my taste. And I think that's kind of what T. Kingfisher is known for. Again, I've just read the two Sworn Soldier books that are out currently, which are just straight up horror. And then I've read A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, which is more straight up fantasy, and it's for younger readers. So it does have some darker themes, but it doesn't go quite as dark as Hemlock and Silver. Personally, I found that to be rather delicious. My only criticisms of the book is that I do think that by the end, some of the magic was a little bit hand-wavy to just sort of move the plot along and wrap the story up. So there were things that were posited as part of this like magical mystery that goes into Anya studying the poisons to figure out what's going on. And then I just do feel that it was a little bit rushed by the end of just kind of using magical hand waviness to explain things. And there is a slight romance in this book. I wouldn't say it's the focal point of the book, between Anya and another very awkward character. So that was kind of sweet, just like watching them be uncomfortable around each other. Although I did find like some of the awkwardness and uncomfortability went a little more towards like the goofy side of things than I think the book really needed, and didn't necessarily match up as well with the tone of the rest of the book. But overall, I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that I actually bought this book, which is more than I can say for a decent number of the hardcover new releases I have purchased recently. I did also finish reading my next Christopher Marlowe play, which is Dr. Faustus. I'm not going to talk about that here because it's going to get its own video that has like more detailed thoughts and analysis of like the literature. But I did like that. I liked that play a lot. This was my second Marlowe play. I'm going to read all of them, basically like one per month until I read all 6. So let us wrap up then with a couple new books that came into my life recently. A bunch of the various big box retailers, I think in their efforts to compete with Amazon, have had great sales recently on like their books, music, movies, like a big media sale basically. So I picked up 2 books in one of those sales. One of them was Crocheting Magical Creatures. It is a book of 20 amigurumi patterns, which are basically like little plushies or toys. And I picked this one up because I have a book that is a bunch of amigurumi patterns, but it's mostly like foods and realistic animals, and I wanted to make a couple things that were like little dragons, or they have like a little mushroom person, a mermaid, an ogre, an adorable flying pig. So that was more of just like a hobby buy for me. And I don't always buy like crochet pattern books. I tend to get a lot of like PDFs online. But if there's a critical mass of projects I think I might want to make, I do like to get the book or check it out from the library and have that. And then, again, not a typical book purchase for me, but something I am excited to dive into is The Elements of Baking, Making Any Recipe Gluten-Free, Dairy-Free, Egg-Free, or Vegan by Katerina Kermel, which I think is how you pronounce her last name. This is a cookbook that I was very interested in because a lot of my family members either have food allergies or celiac, various different things that require us to eat gluten-free, and not all gluten-free food is created equal. So what I tend to do, because I have a lot of friends who are gluten-free, vegan, or both, and then my family members as well, what I tend to do is I try to make a recipe for the first time just completely as written and then adapt it to see, okay, now I know like what the recipe is supposed to be like, now I can make my substitutions and try and make it a gluten-free recipe. But that doesn't always go according to plan or well, and I think I could be more consistent and methodical about it. Fortunately, this woman has food allergies and a PhD in inorganic chemistry, so this is definitely a cookbook that leans very heavily into the science of baking, and I am super here for that. Ready for this cookbook that's going to be like a delicious textbook that I cannot wait to dive into. So that is the first half of my October reads. Really hoping that the second half of the month we can rally and I will just have some reads that are a little bit less frustrating. But yeah, if you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought. Also share down below, did you have a book that you loved or hated so far this month? Or a new book that you came into your life that you're really excited about? Failing that, just let me know something that's fall or autumnal in your life that you are appreciating right now. I'm definitely really appreciating the cooler, crisper air. It's such a relief. So anyway, thank you all as always so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.